All right, welcome everyone to this session about creatively telling the data story. We have a whole panel of presenters here who are going to share with us how their organizations use data in evaluating their services. I'm giving just a couple minutes or a couple seconds really for folks to filter in. I see the numbers still popping up there. So I'll give very brief introductions, but then each of our presenters will share their roles and their organizations and how they use data in those roles. So we will start off hearing from Captain Michael Giles of the St. George Police Department. Then we will hear from Jeff Ojeda, who is an education specialist with Utah State Board of Education. Then we'll have John Krantz, who works for information technology for both the Criminal Justice Advisory Council for Salt Lake County and also the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice Initiatives. And then at the very end, we'll hear from Tom Ross, who is the Executive Director for the State of Utah's Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice. So with that, go ahead, Captain Giles, we'll let you take it away.
Great, thank you. What I want to cover today is the St. George Police Department's approach to homeless mitigation, data collection, and reporting, and show some of the challenges that we face. I'm going to share my screen to walk through because I think it's easier to share the information online this way. Let's see if I can get this to full screen. So really, when we talk about mitigation in our department, we look at engaging in law enforcement activities which address unsafe or illegal conduct, which inhibits stability for anyone who's homeless and seeking a path to that stability. There's a variety of efforts that we go through, ranging from identification of people we meet on the street, who they are, what their circumstances and special considerations are, mental health, addictions, and other triggers that we may need to be aware of. We try to educate people we come into contact with, not just homeless, but the general public, with our encounters on state laws, city ordinances, and the approaches that we take in enforcing those. Every municipality and organization is different. We try to incorporate homeless referrals for homeless shelters, community resources that are available, whether it be an access center, doctor's free clinic, domestic violence shelters, things like that, to try to get them in touch with the resources that can aid them best in moving out of the situation that's impacting them at the time. Through all of that process, there comes a point in time at which there may be an enforcement effort that needs to take place, and that's done through proactive enforcement of the laws and ordinances based on conduct. So this isn't just a philosophy in dealing with one segment of the community. Our activities are based upon individual conduct, not on the classification of who they are, what their circumstance is. We don't employ a specialty unit for homeless mitigation and outreach. We train all of the officers on various laws and circumstances they need to be aware of when they're encountering homeless persons and other people in the community. The one unit that really is specialized, because they're not dedicated to calls for service, is our bike patrol unit. They patrol the bike paths and the parks. And when it comes time for cleanup of camps that have been abandoned or have become hazardous or a nuisance, they perform those duties because they're special constitutional considerations and property considerations that they have to take into effect. So in all of our activities, our records management system, the RMS, isn't necessarily designed to document the analytics. It's designed for a specific purpose of collecting specific data elements to support probable cause or an officer's activities. In looking at the definition of what data is, it's the facts or information collected for reference or analysis. It doesn't attribute a quality or a perspective. It provides for a quantity or an aggregation of data that can be analyzed to tell a story. But the data doesn't necessarily, I think, in all circumstances, provide the context for the full story. It directs focus and research and further actions that may help with that. So to show that with the homeless mitigation grant reporting and the activities that we're involved in, to collect the information to see what trends there are and what impacts we're having or what activities we're involved in. I've screenshotted the process that I end up going through to research. Like I said, officers will go in and they'll do a report, but we don't have a custom report that spits out homeless related detail or alcohol offense related detail. So we've created a system where we use specific search criteria that an officer needs to put in, whether it's a nature of vagrancy, which would be dispatch receiving a call. They nature it according to what it sounds like they are sending an officer to deal with. We have offense codes that deal with transient assist or vagrancy, or we've established an LT54 code that is used to specifically state this is a shelter or a homeless related issue. And then there's keyword searches that I perform to extract any incident that's tied to that. That allows me to pull all of those incidents into a spreadsheet, and the metrics currently for these reporting purposes, each element is represented by a column, and you can see not all of the columns are filled in. The incident number, various information on how it was received, who called it, and what the nature was, and the time that the incident was reported are there, but response times, whether it was an emergency, who was involved in it, all of those details are lacking. So each incident on that list requires a manual search to go in and determine, in this specific case, it's a disorderly conduct report that actually ended up being offenses that included disorderly conduct, trespassing, lewdness involving children, resisting arrest, and this was cleared as an arrest. In searching the incident, we are able to track down, has the person that we're dealing with been involved previously, how many times in previous years, and what information was received by dispatch in the dispatch screen to show the initial information that came in about somebody exposing themselves with children present, the time that officers arrived is actually a submenu from that that shows all of the officers' radio log activity for that incident. So through going through all of those times and all of those data elements, we can complete the table. We have the response time, whether it was an emergency, how many times last fiscal year we dealt with somebody at the same, officers dealt with them on an individual basis, and so forth. Now we start to get into the data elements that actually make sense of all of that raw information. But I wanted to illustrate what it takes to get to certain data elements that people are starting to base policy decisions or operational decisions upon. So based on that, and excuse me while I sit forward so I can see it, it may be a little bit small on your screen, but the disposition codes, we break it down by arrested, cited, a medical clearance or other, meaning no law enforcement action or medical was taken care of or addressed. And the percentages break out that most contacts result, about 71% of our contacts in the first quarter of this year resulted in no formal action, no medical arrest or citation. We can look at who initiated, whether it was by officer or by citizen. This is where it starts to become telling, this disposition for multiple contacts. During the first quarter of this year, this is a list of 83 contacts in which the person contacted had 2 or more involvements with police. This yellow section shows one individual that had 4 clearances with no action taken. So either they weren't located but were identified, or there was no formal action taken. Twice they were cited for offenses, and then twice arrested for offenses. How it was received, and then the response times by nature. We can start breaking that data out to make sense of it. The limitations that we have when we talk, the data tells a story, and what does success look like in the data? It's really hard to quantify that. Well, quantifying it with the numbers is one aspect. But in generating those reports and going through the specific report by report review, we start to see what are the outcomes. These are some various clippings from across the country on homeless camp cleanups, where you can see in the background and in the stories that there's a large amount of debris and a lot of focus that is put by agencies on mitigating those camps. And in this middle one, a man is fatally shot at a homeless camp in a major city in the US. So the numbers I've shown you, what do they tell you about this circumstance and how can you evaluate success on that? It's the qualitative results. I took both of these pictures yesterday afternoon and this morning. There are two locations in St. George. The one on the left is a primitive park that's being developed into more of a developed park, but regular walkthroughs, patrols, and mitigation activities have kept this park looking the way that it is. On the right side is one of the main trails that runs through the interconnecting trail system, and you can see the tunnel going through it. You can see different colors of paint on the walls because when graffiti goes up, our parks department responds and takes it down. Those are items that don't show up in the metrics. And that's one of the challenges we face in our reporting and the discussion is how can you reflect those results when it doesn't quantify the absence of the offenses or the problem. It just quantifies formalized documentation of the interactions we have. I believe that takes me right down to my 10 minutes. So I'll stop sharing my screen, I guess.
Thanks, Captain Giles. I think my turn to go next. Hello, everyone. I'm Jeff Ojeda from the Utah State Board of Education. It's an honor and a privilege to be with my esteemed colleagues here with me today. I'll be sharing with you the data points that we collect in education on homelessness. And it starts actually by the definition of McKinney-Vento, which is federal law. And the purpose of McKinney-Vento is to remove barriers that derive from homelessness caused by a lack of fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence for students. So the purpose is to remove academic barriers that may be caused by homelessness, barriers that hinder students in full participation in school-sponsored activities, and to create stability in school for students that are in a homeless situation. Because we know in some cases, many cases, stability at school is the only stability that these students have. So every local education agency, that is, whether it's a district or a charter school, both fall under that definition of a local education agency, must identify students that are in a homeless situation. So they must purposely seek out those students by any means necessary. They must post public notice of McKinney-Vento rights to parents and youth in public places and heavily used areas so that any student or family member can find that information readily available. They must provide professional development and support on McKinney-Vento to school staff, connecting children in preschool, connecting kids also in those situations to preschool, Head Start, and early interventions. And they must connect families and youth to housing, health, and mental health services. The role ends there with the connection. So once a family or a student has been notified that there is a service available to them, then it's up to them to move forward in that and seeking out that service. And oftentimes our liaisons do quite a bit even past that to help support our kids. But in general, that's where their official role ends. Yeah. And when we talk about McKinney-Vento students, we need to discuss who's eligible also. So children and youth who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence are kids that are sharing housing of others due to loss of housing due to economic hardship or a similar reason. And that's a different definition than the HUD definition. So that's important to note there as well. Kids that are living in motels, hotels, trailer parks, or campgrounds due to a lack of adequate accommodations, Kids that are living in emergency or transitional shelters qualify, that are living in public or private places not designed for regular use as accommodations, kids living in cars, parks, abandoned buildings, substandard housing, bus or train stations, or similar settings. When we talk about substandard accommodations, that specifically refers to checking of utilities for that place, looking for infestations, mold, any dangers, that kind of thing that can qualify students as well. And then the last portion of the definition is an unaccompanied child or youth who meets the definition of being homelessness but does not have or is not in the custody of a parent or legal guardian. And with that, both the state and school districts and charter schools have a responsibility to review policies to remove barriers that get in the way of success, academic success for our kids. So they should actively be seeking out ways to make homeless students' academic success as readily available to them as any other student. And it does not necessarily mean that they make things easier for them in the regard that they do above and beyond what any other student would need, but there are needs based on the homeless situation that can be accommodated for and mitigated and should be so that students can find success. And when we talk about what that looks like in our state, the majority of our population in homelessness are Caucasian, but we do have a breakdown of all the standard ethnicities in the state. Oftentimes people think that our homeless population is larger in terms of students or families that may be English as a second language learners, and that's not the case. It's only about 2,400 of our kids. The rest are fully functioning English speaking, and the majority are born here in the US. Our top districts that have higher numbers include Jordan School District, Canyons District, Davis School District, Nebo School District, Salt Lake District, Washington, and Tooele. Those are in order from largest to smallest. And for the last numbers that we have available as to how many students that is, this is for the 1920 year of school. That was 13,863 kids that we identify as McKinney-Vento and have found and have been able to work with. We know the number's higher. We know particularly last year because of the COVID situation that the number is even higher than that. However, those numbers aren't available yet to us because they haven't been verified and gone through by our data office. But in terms of what we collect when we're looking at McKinney-Vento data, we look at where or how students are homeless. So within that number, 13,863, we know that the majority of those are living with other families. And again, if you recall, the definition is slightly different than the HUD definition, and it does include families that are doubled up because of economic hardship. That does not include families that choose to be together. That is a different situation, and that does not qualify kids for the McKinney-Vento status. But it does count for students that are living on a family member or a friend's couch, and they don't know how long they're going to be able to be there. Generally, it's a couple of weeks, and then they have to move on to somebody else's couch. And so what we refer to as couch surfing. So they're going from place to place and don't have a definite place to stay. We also collect the number of kids living in hotels or motels, kids that are in shelters, kids that are in cars, in parks, in campgrounds, and public spaces, and who are living without adequate facilities. We also collect that by grade level. So I can tell you that between kindergarten and 12th grade, that's over 1,000 students in each grade category. And then we look at the standard academic scores as well. So we look at test scores, state test scores, to count their success and graduation rates as well. And that will cover my information. So I'll pass that over to the next person.
Thanks so much, Jeff and Captain Giles. I just want to remind participants that if you have any questions, there's a Q&A function, and that Mary DeMasters and myself are monitoring that Q&A for questions at the end. And with that, I will turn it over to John.
Thank you. Yeah, I should mention that I'm filling in for Jojo Liu, who's the director of the Criminal Justice Advisory Council and the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice Initiatives. She apologizes, but she had a urgent meeting that she just couldn't get out of. So I should mention that those two agencies are not operational in the sense that they provide homeless services or fund homeless services or anything like that. Actually, they're just, they serve in an advisory role to various criminal justice agencies within Salt Lake County. So the data that I'm going to present some data, I have a couple of reports that I want to share, and they just kind of show how we've been able to use this data to kind of try to address some policy issues. So I will share this first one. There we go. So this report is something that I created for the Safety and Legal Rights Core Function Group, which is a part of the Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness. And we have a meeting every 2 weeks. And so I update this data, or I should say every 2 months, and I update this data every 2 months to show basically the, we're interested in seeing, let me scroll to the beginning of this real quick. We're just interested to see, you know, on the whole, what is the share of the jail population that consists of people who are experiencing homelessness, and how are those, how's that proportion changing over time? So we take 2 years of data here, and here we can see it's broken down by those who are not homeless and those who are homeless. And I just give some statistics for the change a year over, and also the month over change. So that kind of lets you know, like, what does it look like, you know, full year after, and also what's kind of going on in the last month that we've collected this data. I should mention that this is self-reported homelessness when they get booked into the jail. So this isn't something that's matched up with, say, the HIMIS data. So this is just self-reported, but the way they do it, they have a flag that indicates whether somebody's homeless or not. And then we also look at reported addresses. Like, so if somebody says 210 South Rio Grande, we know that they were referring to the road home where it used to exist. So we use all those addresses. We also put in things like couch surfing, or I live down by the river, or something like that. And it looks like it's pretty accurate when you look at it. And so this report just kind of shows, like, what thing, you know, how you can obviously see this huge dip from, that was the kind of jail reduction associated with COVID. But then you can see it's been increasing a little bit over time. And then we can also see what's going on in the last month with the homeless population actually dropped 5.3% over the last, going from September to October. We also include data on, we separate the age groups into 18 through 24 and 25 and older, because people who are 18 to 24 are considered homeless youth. And so there are certain programs that are available to them. So the folks at the Safety and Legal Rights Group like to look at that distinction. And also we'll see that it's broken out by male and female, because you know, the shelters, there's one that's just dedicated to females, one dedicated to males. The services are kind of different. So there's interest in just seeing what these numbers look like for males and females. And then this is the booking information. So this just kind of shows the flow of people that are moving into the jail on a daily basis. And so we can see a lot of these numbers have been down over the last month, which is pretty good. So this is just one report that we create just to kind of inform what's going on with homelessness and people who are getting booked into the jail. So I'll show one other report. And in this report, now this one uses HIMSS data. And so this is a project that's also, it's a collaboration between the Safety and Legal Rights Core Function Group, the Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness, DWS Housing and Community Development, and the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office. Since we're using jail data and we're using HMIS data. And so this is one kind of policy report that I think you'll find pretty interesting. Basically, what we had to do was match all these people up with the jail data. And once we thought we had some good matches, in this report, what we did is we looked at 5 different types of housing services that are found in the HIMSS data. And you can kind of see that, in a sense, these types of housing services are kind of from least stable to more stable. Maybe emergency shelter is the least stable form of housing. Permanent supportive housing might be the most stable form of housing. So the question was, do bookings vary along these different kinds of housing services? Maybe in relation to how stable those services are. So basically what I did is I looked at this 5-year period from January 1st, 2015 through the end of 2019. And I just kind of, with each person that was in there, looked at their various enrollments. And a lot of times people would go through different enrollments. Maybe they were in homeless prevention first, then they spent some time in the emergency shelter, and then at some point they were in rapid rehousing, then they go back into the emergency shelter. So I tried to just look at that whole span of time, and then basically what I did is I looked to see if there were bookings that occurred in between these different periods when somebody was in a different type of housing. And so I'm going to go through this pretty quick, just to kind of give you the overview. I won't worry about these other details. We'll just kind of focus on this last box here that shows if somebody was booked at least once for any reason, and that any reason means it could have been a new charge, or it could have been a failure to appear, so a warrant was issued for that person. They could have been sentenced in court, and then that would count as a booking as well. So if we look at this, we can see the emergency shelter, about 30% of people were booked at least once. And then if we go to rapid rehousing, the percent that are booked is much smaller. There's a much smaller number of people here too, but only 4% of these folks were booked. And if we go to homeless prevention, now it's only 1%. If we go to permanent housing, about 13% of those folks had at least one booking while they were enrolled in permanent housing. And finally, transitional housing, just about 5% of those folks had a booking while they were enrolled in transitional housing. So I have a summary here, and this kind of shows these 5 types of housing services that I just listed. And these were the counts of people who had bookings while they were enrolled in those particular services. As you can see, what's kind of surprising is this emergency shelter. We had about 7,776 people who were booked. And the total number of days in jail that they spent over this 5-year period was just over 1 million days. And the cost of being in jail is about $100 per day. So that's about $100 million that was basically associated with these people who were booked into jail. And as you can see, these other services that are what I would call more stable services, the number of days spent are much lower, average days spent much lower, much fewer bookings associated with these other types of housing. And so this just seems to suggest that if more stable housing could be provided, perhaps we could reduce some of that overlap with the homeless population and the criminal justice system. And that's all I had to share.
All right. I guess I'm up next. I appreciate the comments that the other panelists have made, and I think it's exciting to see that we are moving to a place where data is going to play a bigger and bigger role in what we do when it comes to treatment, and certainly in the criminal justice system, trying to find better ways upstream to avoid having to use the criminal justice system for everything and anything that happens crime-wise, knowing that most of this can be addressed in a better place in looking at treatment, housing, all the things that we're talking about. I'm happy to be part of this conversation, and I appreciate the Homeless Summit, those of you that are putting it on and those of you that are involved in this space. I think it's exciting to see where we're heading. As mentioned, I'm the executive director of the Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice, and part of the role that we play for the state is a research and data agency in providing that information to the legislature, governor's office, the commissions and councils that are part of our agency or group, and the state as a whole. And as I came into this role in January of this year, I come from a law enforcement background of 34 years in Bountiful City, 14 of those years as the chief of police. And I can tell you in 2007, when I came in as the new chief there, most agencies were not sharing any data with any other agency, let alone the state or broader groups than that. And there was a real mistrust about what someone might do with the data, or corrupting data, or even sharing things that maybe we didn't want somebody to share. And I remember those early conversations, and subsequently to the conversations we're having now, trying to really find this kind of happy medium where we can use data appropriately and that we need to be able to use in order to drive resources and programming and policy, but also recognize that there are still concerns in this space, and there's always going to be some worry about how we go about doing this. Just before I came in 2020, there were 2 audits that were done by the Legislative Auditor General. One was on the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, started in 2015, and the other was for information sharing and data in the criminal justice system. And even though these are specifically focused at the criminal justice system, I think we all realize and know that the better job we do on the front end, or trying to address criminal justice needs, our state as a whole benefits greatly, and it opens up a lot of other doors for treatment. But we had a huge gap in being able to collect data. You've heard some exciting things happening with these agencies that the panelists spoke about, and what I've seen in the last few years as we've been moving kind of down this path is we're getting better at sharing some information with some of our partners, and maybe the agencies are those closest to us, but there's still not a conduit for sharing at a state level. So even those that are doing big things, robust data things in their counties, we don't oftentimes have access to that at a state level, or it's limited. And part of that's one of the areas as I came in that the governor and legislature as a whole is saying, we want improvements made. We know this is important and necessary. I look back over these last maybe the last decade. And some of you that are involved in the criminal justice space will recognize that we had a lot of conversations surrounding our computer-aided dispatch, CAD 911 systems. And there was a time when we were going to force everybody or there was an interest in putting everyone on the same platform. That didn't work. And the years we spent fighting that, I think probably were wasted in us finding interfaces and ways to share that. And as we built this new committee and group under Senate Bill 159, Senator Andrigg's bill from this last session, we recognized early in that we're not going to try to push state and local all on one platform, but we are going to try to interface and connect and start looking at data that's already required for law enforcement to share. This is specifically a law enforcement bill that was being run, but again, it's kind of opening the door and starting that expansion of multiple ways to share data. And so as we've kind of moved forward in this area, we've already identified that we need a fairly broad group. We have roughly 40 individuals participating on this working committee. And we looked at and said, what are the barriers to sharing data? And my opinion, and I think it's shared by many on this committee, is we have never spent enough time on the relationship piece and the governance piece. So for those that have concerns or fears or worries about sharing their data, we haven't spent enough time addressing that. And we more quickly go to, we need these data points and we need them yesterday. Therefore, we've got to start collecting it. And the problem with that is if you don't build a good foundation and a solid foundation, then the rest of it is going to fall apart and it won't be sustainable. And I think as we've watched individual movements, that's what's kept them largely from expanding. So we realize that this is going to be a multi-year process, and we're going to have to start at a basic level and then build from there. And as we've kind of landed on the phase one portion of this, we are looking at, and we'll have the ability to see almost real-time crime data in our state for the first time ever. The Bureau of Criminal Identification, BCI, as many know it, they've been working feverishly for a while. We've been having these conversations really for a few years, and we're getting close to having crime data, our more serious crimes, part 1, part 2 crime data, instead of being visible 18 months after, which is what we've had, we'll see a monthly dashboard. And when you think about the possibility of having that monthly information and a law enforcement agency being able to see what's happening in their agency, their city or county, that's a game changer, because we've always anecdotally tried to respond to what's happening with crime and how bad is it, or where are we making the improvements. This gives us an opportunity to have a much better view of what's happening. So even the resource, deployment side of it, the research component from agencies like mine and others that you've listened to today, we will have access to information that's never been available at that stage. We also have created a criminal justice flowchart. As basic as that sounds, to our knowledge, this may be the first time that we've actually created a flowchart that goes from the first touch of law enforcement all the way through incarceration, in jails, prisons, prosecution, defense, courts, the probation and parole, ultimately even beyond that at some point to treatment, and all the things that we're doing through Department of Health, Human Services, and others, to be able to have that kind of a flow chart to see where the bottlenecks are, maybe where we can improve things by eliminating some of those steps, or at least making it a quicker or easier process to understand. That's going to be a big deal, to especially for those that aren't intimately familiar with the criminal justice system. We're also starting with automating the law enforcement information they're already required to report. Right now, every year there'll be a bill or two that's run by a legislator that's requiring specific data from law enforcement. Most agencies don't have the resources and capacity to provide that. They don't have someone sitting there that can just put a bunch of time and effort into digging through a records management system. We're hoping that this is going to help speed that up. We're going to automate it. We're going to save agency time and give them a benefit of knowledge of what's happening. And then we're going to look at what data points we can add in the years coming forward that really will answer the questions. Another part of what's becoming very clear in this is you have this data need that somebody says, for example, we want to know use of force, or maybe we want to know the homeless population in a certain area. But we don't always know the process and haven't worked through a process to have a general understanding or agreement on what that looks like. So as important as having data capability and a foundation for gathering data, we also need to have a group that can, as these requests come forward, these data points, they can talk about it and say, well, how is it collected in the north end of the state or the south end or in rural Utah, urban, and find commonalities first so that when we actually bring the data point forward, it's meaningful and it's done and it's collected from a significant number of agencies, enough so that it means something in directing the policies. So I know that our time is limited, but I hope this at least shows that we're at a great time right now. I think there's an opportunity to really move this forward. We've had great conversations for years now, and we think we're in a place that we can actually overcome this hurdle and implement something that's really a game changer, not only in helping in the homeless space, but in criminal justice as a whole, in treatment services and connecting more people together. So I'm happy to answer any questions, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all of that information, all of our presenters. Once again, if anyone has questions, you can throw them into the Q&A section. I see that some of our presenters have been answering questions sort of typed directly to participants, but if it's okay, I'd like to ask those out loud so that so that everyone present can hear the answers. So the first question is, how do you feel, I think this was referring to John Kranz's section. How do you feel that your statistics may be linked to the criminalization of homelessness?
Yeah, so I was looking at the types of charges that were associated with those people who are experiencing homelessness during this 5-year period from 2015 through the end of 2019. And of the top 6 charges, 2 of those were, one was shoplifting and the other one was trespassing. And so those would seem to suggest that, these are, people need a place to sleep, people need food to eat. They would almost seem like they're a consequence more of being homeless, right? So I would think that those 2 charges kind of suggest that there's at least a portion of that, of all of those bookings that are kind of just a consequence of being homeless.
Thanks for that. So I think our next question was for Jeff Ojeda. And again, I saw that you answered this in the chat, but just so that everyone can hear your response. The question is there a way to address food insecurity in school-age youth through your work? Sorry, Jeff, you're muted. If you could unmute yourself.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So students who qualify under McKinney-Vento or meet the definition of McKinney-Vento automatically qualify for free and reduced lunch. During this past COVID year, schools also opened up meals to basically any family member that needed those foods as well. And I understand, given the situations of our homeless population, that there were still some difficulties in getting food out, but The reality is that anybody who qualifies under McKinney-Vento automatically qualifies for free meals during the school day.
Thank you. Our next question is both for Captain Giles and for Jeff Ojeda. Could you each speak to the balance you have to strike between providing the services that you offer and also sort of the administrative work of collecting data? And also, what value do you see in collecting data?
Captain Giles, do you want to go first?
Sure.
Okay.
So I caught most of the question. The
I'm happy to
value of the
repeat it
effort
if you
and the
need.
data that we have to pursue, and if I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah, so just the balance between providing services versus sort of the administrative work that comes with collecting data, and sort of speaking to what value you see in collecting that data.
So as far as the efforts, the data collection is part of the officer's regular daily activities. So if they encounter somebody, it's either from a call for service from a citizen, or like I mentioned at the beginning, when they make contact with people, they oftentimes will do a field interview, find out where they're from, what services they're in need of, how we can help out. We've had officers purchase hotel rooms out of their pocket, we hear about after the fact, meals, give them rides to the shelters and help facilitate that. When it comes to their activities there, they're documenting that in the record system that I showed. So the data is all in there. It's the administrative side that, as we discussed, there's not an easy report that says how many of the people that were cited for this offense were homeless and what were the offenses that were involved. And that's where really what Tom was talking about in the complexity of the questions and data. A data analyst really is what you're talking about. It's not the records management system that does that. Somebody has to extract that, compile it in a way that makes sense for the questions being asked. So one doesn't interfere with the other. The street level interface and then the analytics happen separate from each other, and they don't pull resources from the other. Hopefully that answers what the question was looking.
And in education, that collection of data comes as a necessity to help support the student in whatever capacity our liaisons may be able to do that. So understanding the situation that a student is living in can determine what types of services they will need. Understanding their grade level obviously is also a requirement to help meet the needs of that student given the situation. And we know that there are certain things that come along with homelessness that will always be present, such as trauma and such as medical supports and services for families that are in those situations. So it's always helpful to have the data to be able to look at where a student may need supports and then how the system can help support them.
Awesome, thank you. And there's sort of two conversations happening in the Q&A now that I'm going to merge a little bit into one. So one is around serious mental illness and the homeless population being overrepresented in the number of jail days compared to other demographics. And this question asker is asking for, now knowing that data, how do we change policy in order to better meet the needs of those citizens of our community? So I will ask specifically John and Tom, how does Salt Lake County or Salt Lake City use the data that is collected that you both shared to inform policy and to improve the interactions between law enforcement and our neighbors who are experiencing homelessness?
I can go first and then John can fill in. The question is absolutely right. The sad thing about what's happened with the criminal justice system is it's become the de facto treatment for those that we haven't put resources towards to help in any other way. So a good example of this is when you're looking at mental illness back in the 60s, when we started shuttering asylums, which nobody would argue was problematic. Instead of building something in its place, to, in a more positive way, be able to benefit those with mental illness, they started just moving it out into our communities. And I can tell you, as someone that came into law enforcement in 1986, and just over the years as in that profession, the amount of contacts we were having with people with mental illness just grew literally every few years. It just kept growing. So I think we're at a place where we recognize that. Now the challenge is it's not inexpensive to resolve. The data is an important part of this because it's showing our costs are really high in the criminal justice system to try to treat. It's high. And if we can do more things outside of mental illness is a great example, substance use, another great example. If we can do more treatment in front of or outside of the criminal justice system, then the homelessness population is going to benefit and many others. I'm not sitting in front of you saying we've already figured it out and it's done. The problem is that this is expensive, but I think there's an expansion of the receiving center concepts. It's been started in Davis County. We started a program 2 years ago. Salt Lake County is going to be rolling one out, Utah County, Washington County, others. I think there's an interest and an excitement, and we think there could be some funding from some programs, maybe the opioid settlement funds and others that maybe can help to build this in.
If I can add on to that as well, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know other areas of the state are developing this as well, but when it comes to some of the mental health issues, we do coordinate with our local mental health authorities to bring them in, and we're taking steps towards what used to be classified as ungovernable juveniles, mobile crisis teams that come out from the mental health authority, and protocols that are being developed to divert that call. So it's not a police officer going to provide family counseling. It's a diversion to say, is the situation stable? Is the person in a position where they can meet with these alternative or diversionary groups so that it isn't, as Tom had mentioned, it's not a law enforcement function to provide those services. A lot of our function is to provide a secure environment for people who are pursuing those resources to receive them safely. And so I do know that there's those types of activities that are being approached across the state and other venues.
Perfect. Thank you. And then, John, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was just going to mention along the lines that Tom was describing. So I mentioned that 2 charges, trespassing and shoplifting, are maybe closely related to this concept of criminalization of homelessness. But I should mention that the 2 lead charges for the homeless people who were booked were drug charges and liquor law violations like public intoxication. Those 2 together are about 44% of all the bookings. That's the reason for it. So it is very suggestive of a substance use disorder. And just to address the mental health issue, there is an indicator that's in the jail. They call it SPIMI for serious and persistent mental illness, but it's not really a clinical diagnosis. It's more of like an indicator for kind of warning jail staff that somebody might have some mental health issues. But from what I understand, they still do use that information to try to get the public defender's office to provide transportation to mental health services. And then I think they also try to move these individuals into like mental health court as like a kind of a therapeutic justice alternative.
And there is that component to this issue that constitutionally speaking, the government can't force treatment on somebody, can't force the assistance on somebody. And we do deal with people occasionally, and I don't want to misrepresent that it's all homeless or all people suffering from mental health, but we do have instances where resources are offered, but they're not pursued because there's nothing that they're a danger to themselves or others. There's nothing that warrants involuntary or an emergency commitment. And really, as John was mentioning, it may come down to criminal activity that involves them in a drug court or a mental health court or some other diversion that tries to address those treatment issues.
Thank you all. So this is our 5-minute warning. We have one more question in the chat, and then I have kind of a final question that I will ask. But the question in the chat is, and this is sort of broad, so anyone who feels like they could speak to it, that would be great. It says, if the data shows that on average, individuals spend far fewer nights in jail while on a housing program as opposed to staying in a shelter, why do you think that funding isn't being shifted to prioritize housing programs?
Maybe I can give a little insight. I think what's been one of the bigger challenges when it comes to the shifting of funds is we start programs. JRI, Justice Reinvestment, is a great example, and this is another one, but to use the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, the whole idea behind it is it's far more expensive to incarcerate and less effective treatment. So we want to move those funds to the front end or do a better job of that treatment, especially with substance use and also in reentries, people come in. We spend a lot of time talking about that, and we came up with ideas and suggestions and policies. Where we didn't spend enough time talking is how to connect the funds that are being saved in one arena and move them to another, especially when some of that funding is state funding, some of that funding is local funding, and there wasn't a specific requirement or an understanding. So you can say, and rightfully so, as we reduce incarceration costs, and we have in our corrections prison system, that money, you would want that money to shift to the treatment. Yet if you don't have a plan in place and you're not looking at it at each budget step, that money goes into a lot of places where there are needs. And we know that, we whether it's a local government or state government. And I hope that as we go forward, I think that's going to need to be a bigger part of our conversation when we come up with solutions, is how does the money shift and wrap around to do the treatment. I think that's what's lacking the most.
From the St. George side, I've only addressed the law enforcement mitigation aspect, but the city has taken a much broader approach with property donations or allowing no rent properties to be utilized for shelters, properties to be used for the transitional housing. There's a lot of other elements that go into addressing the homeless situation, specifically in St. George, that I'm aware of, that I didn't go into as a matter of time, but it's a holistic approach of coordinating mitigation with resource access to the resources and then the funding to support those programs. On the local level, and Tom could speak more to the statewide level, but locally, we experience those efforts and the city's work towards those.
Awesome. Thank you all. With our 2-minute warning, I have sort of a rapid fire, very short answer from each of you. And that is, what is one category of data or one metric that you wish you could collect and that would make either your job easier or that would really show the effectiveness of your programs? We'll start with Captain Giles.
I think the challenge is metrics that show activities that don't stat, that aren't quantifiable, what efforts are paying off that can't be summarized with a number. The other stuff, it's a matter of extracting it. It's those things that can't be measured numerically that fit into that measure of success or progress.
Perfect. Jeff?
I think for me in education, one of the key issues that is really difficult to quantify is the reasons for homelessness. And we have as many reasons as we have students that are in that situation and families that are in that situation. But if we were able to look at those numbers and see what are those reasons, then it would open up a broader conversation outside of the confines of education and really deal with a lot of social issues that are in place as well.
That's a great answer. Thanks so much, Jeff. All right, Tom and John, you have 15 seconds each. Tom.
Yes.
Okay, I'll go quick. I would just love to get behavioral health data on both substance use disorders and on mental health. If we could incorporate that, I think it would really help us figure out who these people are that need services. Take it away, Tom.
And lastly, quickly, is having a real-time feel and look at where people are in the system. So if it's homeless, where are they? What are the numbers right now so that we can address those resources to those programs specifically?
Great. Thank you all so much. This was a really great discussion. We are going to end the webinar now so that folks can move on to their next session. But thank you again to the whole panel. This is a really great discussion.
Thank you.